From the Denver Broncos Media Center, welcome to Broncos Country Tonight.
Welcome to Broncos Country Tonight. Today we're talking about building blocks, non-quarterback building blocks. Pro Football Focus did a really fun exercise article talking about their top 10 players they would build around. And you, of course, have to take out quarterback because that changes the entire dynamic. Wide receivers, edge rushers, defensive linemen, no offensive linemen, interestingly enough. 2 cornerbacks. Sauce Gardner from the New York Jets, the only rookie that was on this list, and Pat Surtain, Broncos starting cornerback. So of the top 10 list, you're looking at wide receivers, cornerbacks, you're looking at pass rushers. Is this indicative of where we're at in the NFL right now? Because I feel like if you'd have done this list 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we'd have running backs. We'd have offensive linemen potentially on this list. Is this just indicative of where we are currently in the NFL?
Well, it's where they are anyway. I still think that offensive line is something you need to build around, and you need to look no further than the Denver Broncos last year in order to understand the importance of having a healthy and competent offensive line.
But individual players, like would you say, like like even you take the best left tackle in the league, right, or the best offensive guard, right? Quentin Nelson was considered the best offensive guard. Like, would there be a time 10 years ago maybe you put him on that list?
I'd put him on the list now. Like,
okay.
Though they didn't. I'm saying they didn't. I would. Like, I still believe that you build through the trenches. And I honestly, I think guards are more valuable than the data probably suggests, simply because they don't have great ways of measuring the inherent value of a guard versus a tackle or a center. You kind of have to judge an offensive lineman. And there's some things you can do to kind of try to get a grasp on that. But the reality is if you can find a great guard, elevates the talent around him. You know, he can take blocks one-on-one, doesn't need double team help versus somebody who does. So I do believe that an interior offensive line is more valuable than we let on. I also believe that interior defensive line is more valuable than we let on. If you're able to get A-gap pressure just from defensive tackles rather than having to use a linebacker to get in there or bring a safety down, that makes your defense more malleable. It makes you able to do more things. Look at the Eagles. They were able to get that kind of pressure with their defensive tackles. You go back to the Broncos last year, we usually had to send linebackers down there in order to do things. Now the defense is a little different, 4-man front versus 3-man front, but I do believe that there is more value in the interior of both lines than we let on. We always look at the tackles and the edge rushes, the sexy positions, but reality is a Quentin Nelson or an Aaron Donald on the other side of the ball and can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, interesting. Aaron Donald not on this list, which I think
probably
years
due
past,
to age, but
but Chris Jones was. So
right, as I say, probably due to age. But those guys, Grady Jarrett, over the last couple of years, yeah, you'd absolutely build a defense around those guys. Can build a defense around those guys.
I think it's a remarkable exercise too, because there was a time when we're talking about linebackers as like the captain of the defense, right? The Mike linebacker, the guy that's getting the plays in. There was even more recent where we're talking about safeties being a bit more of the captain of the defense. You know, Justin Simmons and what his role is on the defensive side of the ball. So, I mean, again, there were other positions that weren't represented in this list, but I found it interesting that we're starting with where we know the league has become, where it's wide receivers. You're talking about Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, going through the list. Jamar Chase was on this list. So top-end wide receivers, especially guys, A.J. Brown was on the list, guys that have changed teams, but you can see what their impact is almost immediately, and in part because I think of where the NFL is right now.
Yeah, with Tyreek Hill, it's the speed, that changes the difference. A guy like Nuke Hopkins in his prime wasn't really that over-the-top speed, but he just was always open. You go back and find receivers like that throughout his time in the league, and those guys dictate coverage, Anybody that dictates coverage, whether he's a receiver, tight end, whatever, that's somebody you need to talk about. Jamar Jefferson up in Minnesota.
Justin
Jefferson up in Minnesota. Travis Kelce.
That's an interesting one.
Those guys dictate coverage. If they dictate coverage, then they're inherently valuable. And yeah, they're a piece you build around, because if it changes the way you play defense, then they're inherently valuable.
Yeah, see, the tight end's an interesting one, right? Because and the way they use Travis Kelce, they just kind of move him all over the place, right? But George Kittle's kind of in the same conversation. Rob Gronkowski was one of those kinds of guys. When you have one of those guys, that's absolutely a building block. I mean, we think about the Chiefs' offense and losing Tyreek Hill and what we said about them going into the season, saying, well, it's going to change everything. But I think most of us had an honest conversation saying, but Travis Kelce's still the engine of that thing. Mm-hmm. So the fact that you can keep Travis Kelce out there really does make him a building block, doesn't he?
Well, yeah, and Travis Kelce opens everything up for everybody else because he rules the middle of the field, and it changes the way that you cover. You probably have to bracket him, which means you're probably taking a safety and doing that. Well, now all of a sudden you can't run too high. If you run too high, how else are you bracketing? Are you bringing an extra corner? Well, then they'll switch to running the football. It just makes your offense, it dictates coverages to defenses. So anything that dictates one way or the other, whether it's a defense that's dictating to offense, hey, you've got to double up this guy as an edge rusher or an interior rusher, or on the offense that dictates, hey, this is going to take two people. Anything that does that is inherently valuable in a building block.
Do you think that running backs being off of this list is more to do with the injury and the time amount that they're actually on the field, or more teams going to running back by committee? I mean, Jonathan Taylor just a couple of seasons ago had the rushing record for that season, and he was one of the top guys. He got a little banged up this last year, so I think if you would have carried that back-to-back years, maybe he's in this conversation. But I still think that for the point of the exercise, if I had an elite running back, a guy that really does sort of dictate to defenses what they have to do, I sort of feel like that's in the conversation of building block.
Well, you have to. The problem here is durability, and the window of which that person has the height, the pinnacle of their career. The running back window is like 2-3 years, and that's really it. So if you're building a team around a running back, you got to get it right the first time because your window is so small that you've got to capitalize, and then it's over. There are exceptions to the rule. I mean, Jerome Bettis had a long career. Frank Gore had an astronomically long career.
Right.
But the reality,
Curtis Martin, come on now.
Right. But the reality is most guys get hurt. And they're in a position that's one of the more violent positions. It takes the most hits. It takes the most vicious hits. It's just not a position that's easy to build around because there's such a small window involved there. So that's part of the reason that I think you're shifted away from that. It doesn't mean that a running back can't be inherently valuable, but if I were building a team like that, I would invest all along the offensive line and then hope I struck gold on the running back through the draft eventually in a cost-controlled manner.
Going back to cornerbacks with Pat Surtain on there and Sauce Gardner, once again, another L for me because I was not as high on him coming into the draft, but he looked pretty good in his first year, All-Pro. No big deal.
Yes.
But Pat Surtain has only built on what is already a really impressive start to his career. He had the one game against Devontae Adams, I think a little bit in the Carolina game, but otherwise Pat Surtain looks like exactly the kind of player you build around. So then you start to think about how we value that position not only in free agency and in the draft. And where we saw last year all of these wide receiver contracts getting paid out, right? Massive trades and contracts. And you start to wonder if cornerback is going to end up being one of those positions as well at some point.
Well, it will be immediately because it's punch, counterpunch, in this league. So what you're going to have is an adjustment to the other side. You have receivers that are dictating coverages to defenses. Well, now defenses that dictate which receiver you can go to on offense, they're going to get the money. Pat Surtain, Sauce Gardner, these guys that can play in man coverage and lock you down, and they'll lock you down longer than the average guy, and that will allow a pass rush to get home. And if you can do that, that makes you, again, inherently valuable. Quarterbacks aren't going to want to throw to that side of the field very often. And so that dictates what you're going to do on offense. So, again, make something that's a building block and something to build around.
But you also have to factor in, too, about what kind of defensive scheme you're running, right? I mean, it's good to have talent at cornerback no matter what scheme you're running. But if you do a lot more zone versus man, we talked about the different defensive coordinator that the Broncos are interviewing right now and how Pat Surtain would be stressed in like, say, Rex Ryan's scheme more so than maybe a couple other schemes, right? So what you're looking for there, you always want the talent, but you do think that there's going to be times when we don't get to see the shutdown corner based on a little bit of the scheme. They're not put on an island nearly as often, depending on the scheme.
Well, sort of. I mean, it's your base, yeah, but all schemes turn into a man eventually. The play drags on long enough, it all turns into man, right?
Good point.
So at that point, you've got to be able to hang with a guy. So that's the thing. You can run, you could even run a Tampa 2 like Lovey was running, I guess. There's a few teams that still kind of run that. Eberflus, has a little bit of Tampa 2 in what they do. But reality is the idea of a low zone corner like Rondé Barber just doesn't exist anymore. Rondé Barber will be a safety in the modern NFL. He just wouldn't play corner. It might be a nickel guy, but in a C4 scheme. But beyond that, I mean, he's a safety. Because that's what happens. You have what's called quarters match, which is what Vic Fangio and Nick Saban have largely made their careers on. Is the vogue defense these days, and what that is a zone defense that eventually turns into man after you get to a certain point, right? After the routes have been completed, well, they're in their zone for now. Now you have to pick that guy up and go, and so you still have to be able to cover in man. The idea of a zone corner doesn't really exist anymore.
I actually think you're right on that, but I thought it'd be a fun conversation either way. Okay, last thing here. So I sort of talked about how I viewed this thing as, every decade we probably could do a top 10 building blocks in the NFL, and it would be a different mix. There would be, I think, 30 years ago, linebackers on that list. You'd be like, oh, well, you got to have this one middle linebacker that is the captain of the defense and sees everything, right? So what do you think in 10 years when we're doing a top 10 building block, what kind of positions do you think will be on that?
I think you'll see linebackers get a little lighter. I think linebackers will save. Steve Atwater would be an inside backer in the future, right? I think that's what you get. Is you're going to get
Hall of Famer Steve Atwater, yes.
Hall of Fame, Mount Rushmore candidate Steve Atwater.
Yeah, Hall of Famer's a linebacker too.
I think that you need more speed. You look at the modern NFL, and it is predicated on speed. Al Davis was a bit ahead of his time with running the track star offenses on some of this stuff, but that's really what it is. You look at teams like Miami or San Francisco or whatever, and that's kind of what in Kansas City it's predicated on speed. And if you don't have a linebacker that can keep up with a tight end, you're going to struggle. It's going to limit what you can do. And if you have the speed at that second level to be able to keep up in man, well, that makes you versatile. You can run anything. You can run cover 0, cover 1, cover 2, cover 3, cover 4, cover 6, whatever, because you are multiple. You don't have to hide that guy in a zone. So that's the future. The future is I think stouter up the middle. I think defensive tackles get a little bigger, and edge rushers get a little more nimble. Inside backers a little faster, probably a little lighter. Corners, you're going to see the Pat Surtain mold. As like if you're big and you can cover, they can get you out there. And then safeties are kind of catch-alls back there. It'll be interesting to see. Right now, too high is vogue. If the league kind of shifts back to one high or not.
All right, for Benjamin Allbright, I'm Ryan Edwards. Thanks for watching Broncos Country Tonight.
You can stand up and salute in Denver, and you got the world champions that live in your town.